Patty Williams had always existed on the razor's edge between fragile vulnerability and dangerous obsession, but this time, something inside her finally snapped in a way that no one in Genoa City could ignore or contain. And it all began with Jack Abbott's rejection, firm, unmistakable, and devastating to a woman who had built an entire emotional reality around the belief that they were destined to be together. In Patty's mind, their connection wasn't just history. It was fate, something inevitable that had been delayed by outside forces, misunderstandings, and most of all, Diane Jenkins, the woman Patty had come to see not just as a romantic rival, but as the embodiment of everything standing between her and the life she deserved. And when Jack looked her in the eyes and told her, gently but clearly, that there was no future for them, that whatever they had shared in the past belonged there and could not be resurrected, it didn't just break Patty's heart, it shattered her sense of reality, sending her spiraling into a dangerous psychological freefall where love twisted into resentment, longing curdled into rage, and the line between devotion and destruction disappeared entirely. At first, the signs were subtle, easy for others to dismiss as just another episode in Patty's long history of instability. But beneath the surface, something far more sinister was taking shape as she began to reinterpret every moment, every word, convincing herself that Jack didn't truly mean what he said, that he was being manipulated, controlled, even trapped by Diane, and that if she could just remove that obstacle, everything would fall back into place the way it was meant to be. This belief took hold with terrifying speed, feeding off Patty's deep-seated insecurities and her inability to cope with rejection, until it became an unshakable conviction that justified actions she might once have hesitated to consider. And soon, her thoughts turned darker, more focused, more dangerous, centering on a single, chilling idea. If she couldn't have Jack, then no one could, not Diane, not anyone, and certainly not in a world where Patty was left alone to suffer while others lived the life she believed should have been hers. Meanwhile, Jack remained largely unaware of the depth of Patty's unraveling, assuming that his rejection, though painful, would eventually be something she could process and move past with time and support, but that assumption would prove to be a critical miscalculation, because Patty was no longer operating within the bounds of rational thought or emotional balance, and as she withdrew into herself, she also began to plan, her actions becoming more deliberate, more calculated. As she watched Jack and Diane from a distance, her mind constructing a narrative in which Diane was the villain, the manipulator, the one who had poisoned Jack against her and stolen the future that rightfully belonged to Patty. Diane, for her part, sensed that something was off, an unease she couldn't quite shake whenever Patty's name came up, but even she underestimated the extent of the danger. Focusing more on maintaining her relationship with Jack and navigating the usual tensions of Genoa City than on a threat that seemed, at least on the surface, to be under control. However, it wasn't long before Patty's behavior escalated in ways that could no longer be ignored, her appearances becoming more erratic, her words more intense, laced with an undercurrent of menace that made it clear she was no longer just heartbroken, she was unhinged, driven by a singular obsession that left no room for reason or restraint, and the turning point came when she confronted Diane directly, her composure cracking as she unleashed a torrent of accusations, blaming her for everything, for Jack's rejection, for the pain she felt, for the life she believed had been stolen from her, and in that moment, it became clear that Patty wasn't just lashing out. She was issuing a warning, one that carried a chilling implication of what she might do if pushed any further. Diane, shaken, but determined not to show weakness, tried to stand her ground, to assert that Patty needed help, not confrontation. But the encounter only seemed to reinforce Patty's delusions, convincing her that Diane was not only the problem but also the key to solving it, and from that point on, the situation became a ticking time bomb, with Patty's obsession intensifying and her grip on reality slipping further with each passing day. Jack began to notice the changes too, the unsettling encounters, the way Patty seemed to appear at the most unexpected times, her eyes filled with a mix of desperation and something far more dangerous. And while he initially tried to approach the situation with compassion, recognizing Patty's long history of mental health struggles, it quickly became apparent that this was different, that her behavior had crossed into territory that posed a real threat not just to herself, but to those around her, particularly Diane, who had become the focal point of Patty's anger and fixation. As tensions escalated, the sense of impending crisis grew, with each interaction adding another layer of unease. Another hint that something irreversible was on the horizon, and despite attempts to intervene, to reach Patty, to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control, it became increasingly clear that she was beyond the reach of reason. Her actions now guided by a distorted sense of purpose that justified whatever means were necessary to achieve her desired outcome. In Patty's mind, she wasn't the villain of the story. She was the wronged woman, the one fighting to reclaim what was hers. And that belief made her all the more dangerous because it removed any moral barrier that might have otherwise held her back, leaving only the raw, unfiltered drive to act, to eliminate the obstacle, to force the world to align with her vision of how things should be. And as the lines between love, obsession, and violence blurred beyond recognition, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake everyone involved to their core. A moment where the consequences of Patty's unraveling would finally come to a head, and in that moment, there would be no turning back, no easy resolution, only the stark reality of what happens when a broken heart turns into something far more destructive. And as the tension reached its breaking point, one question loomed over everything else. How far would Patty go to claim the life she believed was hers, and who would pay the price when she finally decided she had nothing left to lose? The tension that had been building around Patty began to ripple outward, touching everyone connected to Jack and Diane in ways that felt both immediate and ominous, as if Genoa City itself could sense that something volatile was about to explode. Jack tried to take control of the situation the only way he knew how, by confronting it directly, but even as he told himself that honesty and compassion would reach Patty, there was a growing unease in his gut, a quiet instinct warning him that this was no longer a situation he could manage on his own, that whatever fragile grasp Patty once had on reality had slipped beyond his reach. He arranged to meet her, hoping that looking her in the eye and setting clear, undeniable boundaries would finally break through the illusions she had constructed. But when Patty arrived, there was something different about her, something chillingly calm that felt far more dangerous than her previous outbursts, because it suggested a level of focus, of intent that hadn't been there before. And as she spoke, her words were measured, almost eerily composed, yet laced with a disturbing certainty that made it clear she hadn't abandoned her beliefs. She had simply refined them, turning her pain into purpose. She told Jack that she understood now, that she saw the truth he couldn't admit, that he was trapped, manipulated by Diane, and that she was the only one who could set him free. And though Jack tried to interrupt, to correct her, to bring her back to reality, it was like speaking to someone who was hearing an entirely different conversation, one shaped entirely by her own perceptions and convictions. Meanwhile, Diane couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that Patty's presence lingered just out of sight, a shadow that followed her through her daily life, turning ordinary moments into something tense and uncertain. She confided in those closest to her, admitting that she didn't feel safe, that Patty's behavior had crossed into something that couldn't be dismissed or ignored, and while some urged caution, others believed it was just another temporary spiral, something that would pass as it had before. But Diane knew better. There was an intensity to Patty now that felt final, as if she had reached a point where there was no going back, and that realization settled into her bones with a quiet but undeniable fear. Still, she refused to let that fear control her, determined not to give Patty the power she seemed to crave. Yet, even as she projected strength, she couldn't ignore the subtle changes in her own behavior, the way she double-checked locks, avoided being alone when possible, and remained constantly aware of her surroundings, as if bracing for something she couldn't yet see but knew was coming. As for Patty, Her world had narrowed to a singular focus, every thought and action orbiting around the belief that she was on the verge of reclaiming what was rightfully hers, and in that distorted reality, every step she took felt justified. Even necessary. She began to plan more concretely, her actions no longer impulsive but deliberate, methodical, as she considered how best to remove the obstacle she believed stood between her and Jack, and, while there were still fleeting moments where doubt tried to creep in, they were quickly silenced by the overwhelming force of her conviction, a conviction that had become her anchor, her guide, her reason for moving forward. She watched, she waited, she studied the patterns of Jack and Diane's lives, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities, until the pieces began to fall into place in a way that felt almost inevitable, as if everything that had happened up to this point had been leading her here, to this moment where she would finally take control of her own story. The collision of these three paths, Jack's desperate attempt to maintain order, Diane's growing fear and determination to protect herself, and Patty's escalating obsession, created a volatile triangle that seemed destined to implode, and when it finally did, it wasn't in a slow, gradual unraveling, but in a sudden, explosive confrontation that forced everything into the open. It happened on an ordinary day that quickly turned anything but, when circumstances brought them together in a way none of them could have fully anticipated, and as emotions surged and long-suppressed truths came to the surface, Patty's carefully constructed composure began to crack, revealing the raw intensity beneath, the desperation, the anger, the pain that had been building unchecked, and in that moment, the full extent of the danger became impossible to ignore. Her words turned sharper, her movements more erratic, and the line between threat and action began to blur, leaving Jack and Diane with the terrifying realization that this was no longer just a psychological battle, it was a physical one, with real, potentially deadly consequences. Jack tried to reach her one last time, appealing to whatever part of her might still be grounded in reality, reminding her of who she was, of the history they shared, of the fact that this wasn't the solution to her pain. But his words seemed to only fuel her resolve, reinforcing the idea that he was being held back, that he couldn't see the truth she was offering him, and that left her with no choice but to act. Diane, standing her ground despite the fear coursing through her, refused to be painted as the villain in Patty's story, pushing back against the accusations and making it clear that she wouldn't be driven out or silenced, and that defiance only heightened the tension, pushing the situation closer to the edge of no return. In that charged, fragile moment, everything hung in the balance, the past and present colliding in a way that made the future feel uncertain and precarious, and as Patty's grip on control slipped further, the outcome became increasingly unpredictable. A stark reminder that when obsession takes hold and reality is rewritten to fit a single, consuming narrative, the consequences can be devastating, far-reaching, and impossible to contain once they are set in motion. The aftermath of that explosive confrontation did not bring relief or resolution. If anything, it deepened the sense of dread that had settled over everyone involved, because while the immediate crisis had been momentarily contained, it was painfully clear that nothing had truly been resolved, and the danger Patty posed had only grown more unpredictable. Jack couldn't shake the image of her eyes in that moment, the way they had burned with a conviction so intense it bordered on something unrecognizable, as if the woman he once knew had been completely overtaken by a version of herself driven solely by obsession and desperation, and no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, to remind himself that Patty had struggled for years and that this was another episode in a long pattern. Something about this felt different, more final, more volatile, as though she had crossed a line that couldn't easily be uncrossed. He found himself replaying every word she had said, searching for clues, for some way to anticipate her next move, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Patty was no longer operating in a way that could be predicted or understood through logic. And that realization left him with a sense of helplessness he wasn't used to feeling. Diane, on the other hand, had moved beyond unease into something far more concrete, fear sharpened into survival instinct. She refused to let herself be paralyzed by it, but she also wasn't willing to ignore the reality of the situation any longer. Recognizing that Patty's fixation had zeroed in on her in a way that made her a direct target, not just of anger, but of whatever action Patty might decide was necessary to fix her world, she began taking steps to protect herself, quietly at first. Not wanting to escalate things or give Patty the satisfaction of knowing she had gotten under her skin, but as the days passed and the tension failed to dissipate, those precautions became more pronounced, more deliberate, as she accepted that this was no longer a temporary storm to be weathered, but a threat that required constant vigilance. Even in moments that should have felt safe, there was an undercurrent of anxiety, a sense that something could happen at any time, that the next confrontation might not end with words alone. And then there was Patty, existing in a reality that had become increasingly detached from everyone else's, where the events of the confrontation had only reinforced her belief that she was justified, that she had been pushed to this point by forces beyond her control, and that the only way forward was through decisive action. In her mind, she had tried reason, she had tried patience, and both had failed because Diane remained an immovable obstacle. And Jack continued to resist the truth she was offering him, and so her thinking shifted once more, hardening into something colder, more resolute, where hesitation was no longer an option and the outcome she desired felt not just justified, but inevitable. She began to move with a new sense of purpose, her actions quieter, less visible, as though she understood now that the element of surprise would be her greatest advantage, and that subtle shift made her all the more dangerous, because it removed the warning signs that might have allowed others to intervene in time. The people around them began to notice the change in atmosphere, even if they couldn't fully articulate it, a tension that lingered in conversations, in glances exchanged when Patty's name came up. In the unspoken understanding that something was building beneath the surface, there were discussions about what to do, about whether more drastic measures needed to be taken to ensure everyone's safety, but those conversations were complicated by uncertainty, by the hope that perhaps things wouldn't escalate further, that maybe this could still be contained without pushing Patty into an even more extreme reaction, and that hesitation, that desire to avoid making things worse, created a dangerous window of opportunity, one that Patty, whether consciously or not, seemed poised to exploit. It happened in a moment that, on the surface, appeared almost ordinary, a setting familiar enough to lower defenses, just enough for the unexpected to strike, and when Patty finally made her move, it was with a precision that revealed just how far she had gone. How much thought she had put into reaching this point. There was no dramatic announcement, no grand declaration, just a sudden shift in the air of a realization that came a second too late, as the situation escalated from tense to life threatening in the span of a heartbeat. Jack's instincts kicked in immediately, driven by a need to protect, to de-escalate, to stop Patty without pushing her further over the edge. But even as he tried to navigate the situation, it became clear that this was no longer something he could control through words or appeals to emotion, that Patty had committed herself to a course of action that would not be easily diverted. Diane, faced with the reality she had feared, found herself balancing terror with a fierce determination not to become a victim of someone else's unraveling, and in that moment, her strength became just as critical as Jack's attempts to reason with Patty. Because survival depended not just on stopping Patty, but on enduring long enough for the situation to shift, for an opening to appear, for something, anything, to break the momentum of what was happening. Every second stretched, heavy with the possibility of irreversible consequences, as the three of them were pulled into a confrontation that felt both inevitable and surreal, the culmination of weeks of tension finally erupting into something tangible, something that could no longer be ignored or undone.